I think from your presence here, it's clear that Michael Govan needs very little introduction to this audience, but he's got many accomplishments, and I'd just like to mention a few. Since coming to LACMA in 2006, Michael has overseen the transformation of the 20-acre campus with new buildings by Renzo Piano and monumental artworks by Chris Burden, Michael Heiser, Barbara Kruger, and others. Under Michael's direction, the museum has also seen a dramatic increase in acquisitions and exhibition programming. From 1994 to 2005, Michael was the president and director of DIA Art Foundation in New York, and before that he was the deputy director of the Solomon Guggenheim Museum, where he was involved with the Guggenheim, of course, in New York and branches in Venice and Bilbao. So we bring you a world expert from the Los Angeles County Museum, one of the world's great museums. Michael, thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Adele. Thank you, Marilyn. And Uri, thank you for this beautiful house. We'll be talking a little bit about museum architecture today, which is topical given Moshe Safdie's architecture, beautiful architecture here, and the success of this facility. LACMA is certainly still a mess compared to the beauty and coordination of this fantastic place. As somebody was saying, there's a new auditorium being built huge, and somebody said, wasn't that always here? Because it's so well integrated into this fantastic campus. So it's a pleasure to be here. And since that's topical, museum building and architecture, I thought I'd talk about that a little bit today. It's a pleasure to be here with you, the Plato Society, and I have to say, when the invitation, I certainly do get some invitations, and the invitation came for this, it sort of jumped off the desk because I had recalled that in college me and 4 other fellow roommates stayed together for 4 years, and after the second year we printed stationery and dubbed ourselves the Plato Society because we love philosophy and reading, and so my college roommates, I figured, would be proud of me to be able to address you, the real Plato Society, today. So I'm honored to be invited. And I thought, maybe just because it's topical, you've heard in the news that we just had an exhibition of architecture. Architecture has been the theme of the Getty's Los Angeles Modern Architecture, which is part of Pacific Standard Time Presents. There's been discussion of the history of architecture in Los Angeles. And the exhibition at LACMA, which was about Peter Zumthor, and the new plans, which also considered history, was made in part at the Getty's provocation that they were doing a large exhibition on Los Angeles architecture history. They knew we were thinking about the future. Shouldn't there be an exhibition about the future? And that's how the exhibition came about, and I have to say it was probably a year or so earlier than I had planned to reveal, if you will, the 4 or 5 years of work with the architect Peter Zumthor to the public, or to the board, actually. I hadn't even gotten that far, but it seemed a great way to do it because it was in the context of something civic, a discussion of the history of Los Angeles and architecture. It was academic, the Getty and other institutions were participating, and it seemed like a better way than to talk about money or what it would cost. Of course, that's all the newspapers cared about, but, I tried, what I was interested in is the whole idea was not what the building looked like, but what it meant, how it functioned. What it looked like was, if not accidental, entirely a function of dreams and thinking about what the museum could be in the history of museums, and what a unique opportunity we had in Los Angeles to reimagine the art museum in general. So I thought today I could give you a little of that background, because of course the newspapers all jump for the money, and if you have questions about that, I'm happy to answer those. But I thought I would give you a sense of where where I started with this, and I know probably you all visit LACMA and know that we have diverse programs and exciting art there. We have wonderful collections, and in fact, I invite you to, if you haven't, please come see the James Turrell exhibition. I'm putting in a plug because it's actually my show. I get to curate a show once every 5 years, and that show took about 10 years, and it was a lot of work. So, and it's a very beautiful thing. So, so I'll take you through this, and we can have a few questions and talk about it if people have thoughts or ideas. And I want to take you backwards a little bit. First of all, start with the premise that museums have been around as we know them for 200 years in the form we know them. And there's a few interesting facts about that. That's a long time on one level, but it's like a nanosecond compared to the history of art, which maybe goes back 35,000 years, or however you want to describe it. So when we talk about museums, we have to not equate them with art. Museums are instruments, they're tools, vehicles, conduits for us. They coordinate, arrange, protect, preserve, but they're not. The art exists before museums, and there might be a time without museums in the future. I'm not, who knows, thousands of years from now if we survive that long. So I want to say that museums which present themselves and their architecture similar to banks as very solid and very having been there forever, and we'll talk about the images of architecture. 200 years isn't that much time in the scheme of art history, but I also note that museums, general art museums like ours, encyclopedic museums, whatever you want to call them, they're the libraries of everything. They actually come from the idea of the Enlightenment in the 17th century of a library, one of everything. Noah's Ark would be a good and relevant metaphor here at the Skirball, to have two of everything from various parts of the world to bring to your locality. But they haven't changed actually in fundamental construction from my mind, and they haven't changed in 200 years when the world has changed. And I'm not talking about the Skirball hasn't changed its models, or contemporary museums haven't been quite radically different, but the Encyclopedic Art Museum is generally what it was since, as I say, really before the invention of the telephone, the airplane, or the popular photograph. And if you think about how those things, telephone could be internet, have changed the way we deal with images, how we learn about global art, how we travel rather than have to bring things to us, how easy it is to go to sites themselves. So it always seemed to me that the museum was ready for a little bit of a reinvention. And of course, not in the end, you'll see that it's not that radical, but it's as much an adjustment as a reinvention. But I think there is a need to rethink it, and even how we visit museums, how we use leisure time, how families visit museums, how they're less formal, all needs to be reconsidered. If you go to the middle of the 19th century, and this is the Louvre, which of course is a palace converted to a museum for the people, and European museums are usually palaces that get stormed and then taken over for the people, and then you try to leave the art in there. In the United States, it grew out of a democracy and out of a sense of education. So here at the Metropolitan Museum, for example, in 1880, it is out of this idea to educate. Interesting fact is that artists were very involved in the beginnings of the founding of museums. And that's a very important thing. I always am trying to bring artists into the refounding of museums. And people say, oh, that's very radical to bring the artists in. We should just bring their work. And I say, artists have always been involved in promoting art and founding museums. Now, if we go to Los Angeles, 40 years after this, you get this. 1922. At our corner, on the bottom right, Fairfax and Wilshire, and you see two little dirt airfields, and you can almost see all the way to the Skirball, not quite, in the little bit of fog there. So we are reminded how far behind we are. However, Los Angeles did grow quickly. We can fast forward just 8 years from this to look at the same scene in 1930. No wonder all the architects and designers and furniture makers from Europe moved to Los Angeles. There was work here, even in the Depression. There were houses and buildings to build. So this ambition of this city to build and to grow, and we're still growing. As some of my colleagues in New York and other cities say about what we're doing even, we still have a lot of runway. We're still growing, and that's an amazing thing to be part of, and that's what I'll talk about a little bit today, too. So in 1913, we get started as the Los Angeles County Museum of Science, History, and Art. And in Exposition Park, and you know this building, part of it was just restored. It was the, I found this, I wish I had this to show you the inside. I actually was in St. Petersburg, Russia, going to old bookstores, which I love to go to. And I'm in St. Petersburg, Russia, and I flip through the boxes, and I find a list of collections and exhibits to be assembled in the Los Angeles Museum of History, Science, and Art. And it's basically a membership brochure from about 1915. It's really fantastic little artifact. And what I note is that by the 1880s in most places, art museums were distinct from museums of natural history or science. Previous to that, if you, and I don't have the slide of Mr. Peale's famous painting of the museum in Philadelphia, where you see paintings next to dinosaur bones, next to natural specimens. And art was part of a natural history. And of course, then we became very clear about separating art, fine arts, low art, craft, natural history and science into separate things. As I see the course of intellectual history right now at the 21st century, almost every important book I read is about blurring boundaries between genres, and that science and art aren't so far away again in our minds. So it's interesting that we've come full circle, and I've been very aware of that, but we were very late to move away from that. But we did, while we were at part of that Exposition Park, collect important works early on. It isn't just that we were starting in the 60s. In fact, Cliff Dwellers by George Bellows on the left, the Degas. The Rivera at the top was bought in 1925, the year it was made, as contemporary art. It's one of the great Riveras in the world. And it's up right now in our exhibition of Gabriel Figueroa, the great Mexican cinematographer that Rivera dubbed the fourth muralist, because his films were as good as he felt their paintings, Orozco, Rivera, and Siqueiros. And some treasures, for example, the artable carpets that J. Paul Getty gave LACMA early on in its history. But that was slow. It was not until 1965, as many of you may remember, having been here, that the citizens and city fathers and mothers brought together funds and collaborated with Los Angeles County to open a grand museum. And it was a grand moment in 1965 when this building was opened. It was a moment of incredible pride. The Music Center had just been built, and Los Angeles was coming of age, and of course every city coming of age, every metropolis would have an art museum. And this was built. There's a funny history that was documented in the exhibition about this building, which of course now we look at and has kind of a nice retro modern feel, although a little bit ornate. It was designed, I think, as you know, by William Pereira, who designed many, many buildings around the city. In the exhibition, I had the documents, including the board's unanimous vote of the Board of Trustees to hire, not Pereira, but Mies van der Rohe, the great master of architecture, the old master, they called him, of architecture at that time, who was thrilled to build in Los Angeles. But they did have to talk to Mr. Amundsen, because he was one of the largest donors, Howard Amundsen, and very generous. And the story went, as I came to LA, is that Howard Amundsen worked with Pereira, and he wanted his local friend to have the job. Not true. Actually, Howard Amundsen had another important architect, Edward Durrell Stone, in mind. And Edward Durrell Stone, who has an interesting and spotty career, but it built one of my favorite museums in the world in Veracruz in Mexico. Mies, of course, built the Berlin National Gallery not long after that. And as the story went, there was a board meeting, and there was a huge argument, and no one could agree, and they all agreed to their second choice, William Pereira, which is nothing against William Pereira. There was you can see the city moment of wanting to reach out to something bigger and more international. And then Pereira's building, I often remark that often, and it's not the case in this museum, architects don't sometimes do their best work for museums. There's maybe a high pressure to it. I don't know what it is, but this skyscraper by Pereira right across from LACMA, super simple and elegant. And this building, even then, was a little fussy. They also had to change the designs. It was not well reviewed when it opened. And then there were technical problems. This idea of the fountains, they leaked within 6 months into the tar, and it was a total mess. People have told me that in black tie events, there was only one way into the museum, which was intended to look like Lincoln Center, and when the wind blew off the Pacific, the race, you always got wet going to the event. Some of you may remember that. I've heard this story so often. I certainly wasn't there, but anyway, it was nice. But the thing is, it's not there anymore, so it's been changed, and I'm sure if these buildings were there today, we might be considering restoring them. But they weren't so well received, even by artists, and this is perhaps the lasting legacy, because you can't see those buildings anymore as they were. This is Ed Ruscha's famous painting, The Los Angeles County Museum on Fire, which is sort of the artist's response to the museum, and does give a sense of the time of the 60s, of that rebellion and the artist and the institution, and you know, it's not totally, he had, you know, Norm's was on fire too in Ed Ruscha's painting, so it's not totally to denigrate the museum. In fact, it comes from very much from a 19th century painting that he was interested in. But it's interesting that this is the image, because you can't see those buildings as they are anymore. So the buildings that were built in the 80s had issues because they were never properly finished, and it was a different attitude, I think, of the buildings that were there in the 80s, and the big wall on Wilshire Boulevard was not the friendliest gesture. And as I always say, you know, it's just building a big wall. In fact, the attendance never really changed after that. And it's not, it actually had ambition. It has a little, and Hardy Holtzman Pfeiffer, who built it, have built beautiful buildings and were very good architects. And it was just somehow that time and the ambition and the problem they had to solve, because the fountains didn't work and they had already been drained, and so it didn't lead to the best circumstance even for the architect. So not to say that there wasn't opportunity and thoughtful effort in those buildings, but they haven't worked, and they aren't working now, which was partially an opportunity, I imagined, and I'll take you through that. When I came to Los Angeles, the Broad Contemporary Art Museum was just about to begin construction. There was a city street where the main plaza is, and we were just beginning, and I made some major changes right away. One of the first changes was to open up the plaza and take the glass off the entrance, and then I'll show you a slide later of Chris Burden's Urban Light. Working with Renzo Piano, the idea was to begin to reimagine the Los Angeles in the 21st century, the museum, a little bit as the town square, with a lot of outdoor space, public sculpture, palm trees. It was Robert Irwin, the Los Angeles artist, when I asked him what did he think, because I had worked with him in New York, he came up with the idea of palm trees, which I'll show. But it was a journey, and what I knew was that there was a real opportunity in Los Angeles, which really was the city of the future, never more than now, as geopolitical, economic strength moves to Latin America and Asia, as the Pacific becomes so important. It shifts the balance culturally as well, a little bit away from Europe, and the west coast of the US, along with the Pacific Rim, becomes very, very important. And I saw that Los Angeles could be really the cultural city of the 21st century, potentially, or one of the great ones. I immediately engaged artists. This is the logo, you know, and I invited 5 firms to come in and design a new logo, because I didn't like the old one at all. Hated all the designs, and then I called my friend John Baldessari. who lives here, because he's good with words and graphics. And he said, I don't know. No one's ever asked me to do that. Let me think about it. 3 days later, he calls me and says, come down to the studio. And he showed me this 1960s photograph of, I don't know if everybody, he said, does anybody know what that gesture is with the thumb and the pencil? Like artists would measure before they draw, right? So it had an archaic quality. Of course, he'd left all the sky because it's Los Angeles, and there's this funny play with the thumb and the artist's pencil and the palm tree and all the sky, and he just underlined the L and the A. That's all he did. It was like as easy as pie. It seems so beautiful, so simple, and we adopted that as our logo, and that began this effort I made to engage artists in the museum as they had been involved to found museums in the 19th century. Here we have the Met about the same time that LACMA was oil fields. You have this ambitious Greco-Roman interior, really Roman baths interior of the central court of the Met with plaster casts as well as bronze and marble sculpture. And I sort of reimagined how we could be absolutely the opposite as I came to Los Angeles, and I said, well, we'd make an investment in ancient art, but I would get a contemporary artist from Los Angeles, and we would make the focus our ancient pre-Columbian collections, our ancient American collections, and commissioned Jorge Pardo, who's Cuban-born, lives in Los Angeles, to do this fantastical installation with the argument that, you know, a lot of what we miss in the museum is the context the objects came from, and you can't ever restore them. A lot of these objects were from graves. A lot of these objects were underground. A lot of these objects were ritual objects. You can never restore it properly, and the rectilinear frame of the museum is not the true frame. So you have some leeway, and the artist can give it some power and beauty, and then the curators called me into a nearly mutiny meeting because they were worried I was going overboard and which department would be next. But I assured them that this was an engagement with artists that was temporary. It was an experimentation. We would use the museum as a laboratory, and it's turned out to be really successful. We've had so many young people engage the ancient American collections, and that contemporary frame has served us well. I started playing with the idea of what's Los Angeles in the 21st century in relation to the paradigm of museums. And so the pre-Columbian rather than Greek or Roman made sense. That's our ancient Americas, feature that. Or the Greco-Roman temple facade. So when I saw Chris Burden's urban light at his studio, which were really lamps that were columns, you know, this is what emerged as our Greco-Roman temple facade. By the way, this is sort of a fake, but there's our fake, too. That's not a real Roman temple. And this is real LA street lamps from the 20s and 30s. So there's a nice play back and forth with what's real and what's fake and and it engages people. And with the, in relation to the other things like the palm trees, they're elements of the street. In the 70s, when I was going to school, there was an effort to tear down the pedestal and the temple of the museum to bring the museum to the people. A democratic idea. Don't put it up on a temple platform. And then we have things like the temporary contemporary or factories as museums, which are beautiful. But you also throw away maybe a little bit of the baby with the bathwater. That art is also about ritual and ceremony. It has been since the beginning of time. And so that notion of a beauty of an entrance, of a ritual, is important. And so for me, this captured everything. It had both ritual, beauty, ceremony. He made the width of the middle so that you could have 2 by 2. People can play around it, and it's of the street as well. So it did everything for me. I was so pleased with this. And I started thinking about other ways, and it just happened that around that time, we had just, it was before we had even finished this, or as we were finishing this, my friend artist Michael Heiser called me and said he'd found the greatest rock he had ever seen. It was in Riverside, California. He couldn't move it to a studio in Nevada, but he thought he could get it to LA. Did I want it? And I didn't skip a beat. I knew I wanted public sculpture, and I said, definitely, having no idea what was involved. But he said, this rock, this is the Colossi of Memnon. I mean, this is it. Immediately leaped to my mind, at the Metropolitan Museum in New York's infancy, the Cleopatras Needle, which was put in Central Park, which was moved with incredible fanfare, people lining the streets, a Colonel Goringe was summoned to by Mr. Vanderbilt, I believe, to move this from Egypt, which was quite controversial. There were protests because it was a little bit of a theft. The government had changed for a moment there, but you know, by golly, London had an obelisk, Paris had an obelisk, and Rome had obelisks, and New York was going to have one too. It's a little bit of obelisk envy. And New York got their obelisk, and it was a public deal, and I knew that history of New York and Cleopatra's Needle, and I immediately imagined, oh my God, this rock is going to roll down Wilshire Boulevard. This is going to be, and I knew Mike Heiser, his father had researched in Egypt, and Mike Heiser's work a lot comes from thinking about Egypt as well as the ancient Americas, and I knew this was our obelisk. You know, this was our marker. This was going to be the opposite of urban light, which is urban. This would be, you know, that object in the desert that has great weight and sense of time versus the 20s and the 30s. And you probably know the story. It was certainly an incredible 9 nights after 4.5 years of planning. We built a specially made truck 300 feet long with 212 wheels. And I asked it to stop to pay homage to urban light when it came down Wilshire Boulevard. It was an incredible moment at 3, 4 in the morning. There were so many people there. It was just so moving, and so many people in so many places in Los Angeles of every culture, economic strata. There's a feature-length documentary that's been made about the journey, which you will see at some point soon. It's going to be publicly available, which really is about, it's about the rock, but it's about a portrait of Los Angeles, because it touched so many people. You'll see the Hanjin shipping sign too. Hanjin Shipping, our Korean friends, sponsored it. I told them, well, it's going to go through Koreatown, not actually knowing whether it would go through Koreatown, but it's hard to miss Koreatown when you're going to LACMA. And they were so proud to, and I was proud to have these, you know, a Korean neighborhood sponsorship, their Korean shipping company, to move the rock. And it's, of course, I think it's one of the most beautiful and monumental. I see it every morning. And as a contemplative sense of weight and time, the lightness and the heaviness, the levitation, it's like Magritte's rock in the sky. And of course it draws school kids and adults and has been reported in art magazines. It's already really become part of art history. And it's a truly wondrous natural object paired with the man-made, and in a series of yin-yangs of weight and lightness, line and pyramid, nature and culture. And then other ideas around that, Robert Irwin, the Palm Gardens. So the idea was to engage artists in framing. And I said about our museum, we shouldn't just be showing art, we should be making art. In every other time and place, cultures have made art, commissioned art of their time, and then we see it later. So that's what we've been doing. You have Robert Irwin, Barbara Kruger, and it's worked. The whole program of opening up the campus, tearing down the glass, open plazas, public sculpture, and here's for my one little promotional advertisement. I'll try to stay away from advertising, but to say we've doubled the campus size, doubled exhibitions, doubled attendance, and the budget's still balanced. So it's all kind of worked out in a nice way for the county. And are you going to Washington? No, I don't think I could solve that problem. And everybody says, well, you know, building buildings or this, we should be spending money on art. We've made 18,000 acquisitions in the last 5 years, over $230 million cash spent on art for Los Angeles County. It's really an incredible achievement for the trustees and the curators. And as you know, we've helped birth in collaboration the movie museum, the first movie museum in Los Angeles. It'll be the biggest in the world, and it will be an incredible draw, and it'll be in partnership with the art museum. And this is about collaboration when this was born of the financial crisis. You know, after a financial crisis, everybody's egos diminish slightly. And we were going to use that building for something else, and the Academy wasn't sure they could afford to build in Hollywood, and it scrapped the project, and we decided to work together. And it's a great story, because the subway will be coming to the corner across. As I said, this was not the friendliest architecture, and it did affect attendance, and it was because they had to deal with the ponds, and it did block the 60s building. So I always knew from the amazing competition in 2001, Rem Koolhaas won, and he said, you can't add on to the museum. You have to start from scratch. Those buildings are ready to fall down. They're not earthquake safe. The pipes, the air conditioning, you're going to spend hundreds of millions of dollars. You have to re-envision your own museum, and only in LA could you do that. I always remembered that. And so, well, I thought there were many issues with REM's building. To bring us to the present, it was a bold idea. To reimagine the museum, and I thought, wow, what would be possible? So I asked questions. What if we did design a museum around the way people engaged with art? What if objects could be rotated to describe various cultural stories, not just one narrative in time and space? What if it could be a comfortable place and a transition to the formal contemplative more easily? What if it could accommodate kids as easily as art historians, which is never built into those old buildings? And what if we could build an energy that building that could produce more energy than it consumed? Because that seems such an imperative for our time. And we began working. I selected to study this Peter Zumthor. You now know that. Before it went, luckily, he had never, at that time in 2006-07, he had not won the Pritzker Prize, Prix-Impérial, British Architects Prize. I went to woo him, and he was interested in LA. He had taught here before, and the Pritzker Prize jury said it all. His buildings have a strong, timeless presence. He has a rare talent of combining clear and rigorous thought with a truly poetic dimension, resulting in works that never cease to inspire. And if you ever visit his buildings, they are like temples to contemplation and beauty. And I knew he could build something in LA that would be unique, and the terms of it were, again, not what it looked like, but what it was. It had to be horizontal like Los Angeles, give back the sky. Organic became an issue because the Japanese Pavilion, which we wanted to restore by Bruce Goff, was organic, and this was a park, so organic became a principle. Accessible became the main principle. If you were going to open a store on Rodeo Drive, would you open it with a brick wall and a door? No. Why do we build our museums with brick walls and doors? It should be glass. It should be open. You should see people inside. You should see art before you get into the museum. It should be transparent. It should be contemplative inside. So once you've bought your ticket and you've had a coffee and you've run around outside and enjoyed the weather, you come in, you see the gardens, and then inside there's a kind of peace. You're not giving away that peaceful contemplative quality that the museum's all about. And overall, it should be efficient. We live in an age of efficiency. In the same square footage or a little bit more, this building would show 5 times as many artworks or be 5 times as many artworks accessible. And as this drawing shows, it's actually, museums use more energy than factories, some of them. They're energy hogs because of their humidity control systems. New technologies would allow us to lower that, and solar panels on that flat roof would allow us to produce more energy than we actually used, which would be an enormous, I think, symbol for LA, especially where there used to be oil fields. And that's that. And additionally, could we free up park space? This plan has more square footage, but gives back 1.2 acres of ground space of the park for gardens and seating spaces. And there's going to be glass underneath, so as I say, even when the museum's not open, you'll be able to see art. So if you're walking your dog in the park, if you have a dog, this will be a very culturally educated dog, because you will be able to see art through the glass every day in the park. That's what an LA museum should be, an indoor-outdoor museum. And the other aspect is, we know with the movie museum on the west, the new pavilions we've built that are drawing 1 million people a year, the subway, we wanted to be, actually, and you've read little bits and pieces in the press about the tar pits, but the whole idea was to get people to the Page Museum and the tar pits by lifting the museum and not having the big block of the museum, because when this museum was built, we didn't have the extra 8 acres that LACMA added to the park. So the flow through was key, and that's the idea of engaging with the tar pits. And to create a symbol, a beautiful civic symbol for Los Angeles. That's sort of part of the idea. So the study centers on the ground level are going to be accessible. There's going to be 5 times, if this comes to pass, many more works accessible. There'll be contemplative galleries. And there's something about the building, I will also say, in its organic structure. Everybody says, why the curve? Peter Zumthor said the building has no front. It's got a continuous curve. But it's just as important that it doesn't have a back. That no culture will be at the back. That unlike certain museums that have a hierarchy of one culture and then another in the story, the idea is we live in Los Angeles in a multicultural community, in a democracy, and that there will be no front, no back. It will be flat, it will be non-hierarchical, and it'll be gathering space. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I think you can see that we picked well, and Michael, thank you so much for being our first presenter. And we'll take questions and answers.
I have a couple of questions, please. While people are contemplating the art in the contemplative museum, are they going to have to do it standing up?
No, this museum actually will probably have quite a lot of seating relative to other museums. That's going to be a lot of built-in seating. In fact, one of the aspects of it is also that there's access from the galleries to he didn't want, you know, most museums have a corridor on their inside and then galleries on the outside. And one of the features of all the glass around the edges is that's all walking space and places to sit with art too. So you can go into a gallery and then you can come back out, and it's meant to be very comfortable is the idea.
And there are places
to sit. Yeah, the idea, he's big on hospitality, Peter Zumthor. He actually likes... And
the art isn't affected by the glass?
No, I should explain from a technical perspective. The glass is sort of the outside corridor, and then there are walls within the glass. So it's a curtain wall, and on the upper level, the formal galleries, we have, by the way, I should note, half of our 110,000 objects are not light sensitive. Greek vases, Natzler, California ceramics, furniture and other things. And the way the glass works on certain furniture, not all furniture. But we have a huge number of things, marble sculptures certainly, bronze. We have a huge number of things, almost half the collections if you look by number, that are accessible to light. And the way the building works, the north side of the glass underneath the covering works almost as museum conditions. We'll have 35 or 30-foot candles in places for paintings. So, and then up, it's for people and for art in that way. So yeah, the glass is really also, Frank Gehry said to me the other day what he liked about the building was you see people in the museum and you see art in the museum, so you're sort of invited in. That's the idea of the glass, but it's thin on the outside. I don't know if you have a microphone, or should we start here and then we can get the microphone there? Well, yeah, okay.
Mr. Govan, I visited your campus a couple of weeks ago and reviewed the plan that you have in the resident building. It's very impressive. My primary question, though, is the building overhangs two significant parts of the La Brea tar pits.
Right.
One in the center and one on the west end of the tar pits. Those tar pits have been there hundreds of thousands of years, if not millions of years. How do you reconcile overhanging those natural pools when it was open to the environment all of that time?
Well, I can answer that very directly. There are two places. There are more than one, more than two, because it's the Tar Lake, and there's currently the design overlapped the Tar Lake. That was actually... we knew that was a little bit overreaching. That was for demonstrating trying to get a relationship to it, because you can't actually get to the tar pits on that side. The fence is so far away. So the idea was to get close but not on top of, so that you could see the tar pit from a beautiful vantage point. Because if you get up a little bit and can get close, it used to be in the old days you didn't have the fence and you could go right up to it and see it better. So the idea is to have an overlook, but we wouldn't overhang the tar pit. So that's already been, we know that's not, I mean, this is a very preliminary design. There's probably 5 years of design. This is more like a competition model. And then there's a second place where there are 5 small pits together. And so we've talked with our friends. There was a scientific report that said that indeed there isn't necessarily an impact, because no animals get in because of the fences. They're not native grasses. They're already shaded by the trees and buildings. So technically there's not an impact in an environmental sense potentially, but there may well be. We've talked to our friends at Natural History, and that's what we're going to study over the course of the next year and a half. And so we'll do that collaboratively with their scientists. And the design is curved, so it's adjustable. That was the real idea, was to point people to the tar pits and sort of highlight them as an important resource. But I would point out they haven't been there for millions of years. Those tar pits are human-made. they're asphalt pits when this was an asphalt pit. So they're not, I mean, they're human-made. They're a couple hundred years old. So that's not, I'm not just, that has nothing to do with wanting to avoid them, but there are some fact issues about it that people need to know. The exciting thing about them is that they do research currently that is relevant to the future, including, you know, research on global warming and other things. So the idea is not to interrupt the science. The idea was to provide better public access to the tar pits, because right now it's really hard to get to them, and they're going to have over 1.5 million people on the west side of the campus that will have to walk all the way around to Wilshire Boulevard or around the Long Way if we don't let them go right through the museum. So there's a lot of love we've actually had towards the tar pits, and we're going to work with natural history to make sure that it works out for the scientists. We did with the, when we built the parking lot, you may know we unearthed mama mammoth and babies and lots of saber-tooths. So we actually worked very closely with their scientists to preserve them. It cost us a lot of money, but it was really worth it, and it was an exciting relationship. So I'm not worried at all. We're going to, if we can avoid them if we want to. It was a gesture of, actually, of love. We had a question over here.
Yes. The question is, what is the current status both of the development of the new campus and financial status?
Okay, I was waiting for the question about finances.
Had to be.
Because I get the question all the time. What? I read in the paper $650 million. Why don't you spend that on education? And I say, one, we don't have $650 million. I mean, towards that we have zero today. Two, we actually spend $3 million a year on education. We're one of the largest education programs in the nation, if not the world, for a museum. Or arts, they say. Three, we spent $220 million on art, and the real deficit we have is the proper care of our collections. That's actually where we fall very, very low on the scale, because those buildings are, I don't know, have any of you been to LACMA when we've had to close galleries for water leaks or had plastic over paintings, or it's really scary. So that's the big deficit. And just to review the numbers, museums today can cost as much as $3,000 a square foot or more if you're the Getty. And I built a museum for $100 a square foot, but it didn't have any climate control. The Broad and Resnick buildings cost about $950 a square foot. And they're not particularly fancy, they're functional. So we took that budget and said, what would it cost? So what we've designed is a building that is about, depending on where it is based on that, we haven't designed it yet, but the idea is that it'd be around $400 million. That's based on square footage at the same rate, $350 for depends on how big you make the building. Some people want it bigger for more art collections, some people want it smaller for lower cost. So you're in that neighborhood. If you were to renovate the existing buildings, which is the other clear alternative for the board and this community, the estimated cost today, without changing a light bulb or painting a wall or making any cosmetic change, just for earthquake retrofit, energy, climate, seismic, seismic and hazardous materials, is $320 million. So I can be honest. I personally don't know how to raise $320 million to retrofit those buildings. I mean, there's just and I've tested it out. There just isn't the level of interest, and it would be to throw away a huge and then I'll add to the equation, with the energy equation of the solar panels, and we have 24 entrances now. This building proposes 4 to 6. We would save so much money in security and energy that it's probably the equivalent delta of a $100 million endowment. So apples to apples, you're talking about 400 versus 400, 420 versus 450. And it would be a shame to throw away 50 years of learning about how people interact with art, how art can be maintained, accessed, curators' ideas, and not give LA a state-of-the-art museum. So those are the numbers. When you hear the 650, that's the idea that it's our 50th anniversary. And it's, don't go back to people many times every few years. We just did a big campaign. If we do a big campaign, we're not going to then go back for another campaign for endowment and everything else. So the idea is to bundle it all into one. And that number happens to fit what San Francisco's raising, what Boston just raised. So the idea is, are we lesser city? No, we should raise that money. That's my simple view on the money, and that's what we're after. The status is, and we've raised a lot of money. We've raised, we've raised $650 million over the last 10 years in various ways. But the status is the board in October would have to green light this plan from a board perspective to spend enough money to get hard cost estimates and schematic design. In October, they decide to take a 1.5-year period to create a feasibility study. Can't tell you what the board's going to say, but I'm hopeful and imagine it's likely. And then we would come back with that, and then the board will begin to raise money at that time, and then we'll see. I can only tell you I'm optimistic. And my timeline, dream timeline, is as follows. 2017, the movie museum opens, and we would have 100,000 square feet plus public space, sculpture, restaurant, bar open with the movie museum. That's the time to close the old buildings, when there's a lot to do there, and also when there'd be too much pressure on parking. And then the subway opens in 2022-23. That's when you want to be open, and you don't want to be closed once the subway opens, because then you'll have mass transit to the museum. So the building window is 17 to 22. If you started building in 18, you'd be open by 22. That's the dream. But it's a lot of money to raise and a lot of people to convince along the way. There was one question here.
Okay. First of all, how do you pronounce your name? It's Govan or Govan?
Govan.
Govan, okay. You mentioned the Japanese pavilion would stay. Are there any other buildings that would stay?
Well, the Renzo Piano buildings stay, all the new construction. And then the Japanese pavilion, the things about it is that the Bruce Goff with Bart Prince designed that. It's a beautiful building. It exhibits a lot of the organic quality, the indoor-outdoor, the study center, very contemplative spaces, and it's now a monument of architecture. So that would be restored. It's also whole, unlike the 60s buildings, which have been literally chopped up, and who knows what it would cost to even rebuild what's there. It's whole. So we would make that part of the restoration. It's the 4 buildings that are 1965 and the 80s buildings that would come down.
And what would happen to the art during the construction?
Well, it's we have 100,000 square feet of space. Just to put that in perspective, the day I arrived at LACMA, we only had 140,000 square feet of galleries. So we just go back to that size, a little bit less, during the construction period. And it's a great chance. When I was at the Guggenheim, we sent our collections around the world, and it was just a fantastic time to have the museum known around the world, as Orsay sent their masterpieces to San Francisco. So we'll both keep some on view in the 100,000 square feet so that the public has access for education purposes and others, and we could send some around the world for that period. Yes? What? The staff?
Would the staff do all this? Buildings are being torn down?
Well, the curators would be working harder than ever, because you can't imagine the work that would be going on during that period. And the now we have, with 100,000 square feet of space, we have a lot of activities. Maybe the security staff might drop, and some of the maintenance staff, but that's, as I said, exactly the moment when the Academy Museum would be adding that much more square feet. So I'm not predicting the future, but in fact, in a pure jobs standpoint, because probably we would coordinate those things, my guess is there might not even be a single change.
So you don't think any administrative staff will lose their jobs?
No, usually, Bill, I've been through 5 building construction projects. Usually you add, not subtract.
Can I speak? Is it my turn? Oh.
Yes.
I want to know what the numbers are of people that go through statistically now, and what your projected figure is for that when it's completed, and how do we compare with the other big museums in the country?
That's a good question, because I think about.
Thank you.
As people who know me know, I'm a quality of experience person, generally more than a numbers person. But when I got to Los Angeles, we're the 2nd largest city in the United States. We have a big population. Admittedly, it's hard getting places, and it's a little more spread out. But we should have a lot of people coming to our museum. So the magic number is 1 million. If you get over 1 million, that's rarefied ground in museums. So the Getty got over 1 million, and they hover around there. The National Gallery in Washington is usually #1, neck and neck with the Metropolitan at anywhere from 2 to 6 million. Through 2.5 to 6 million, depending on the year. The Museum of Modern Art now boasts about 2.7 million. And then you get museums in the 1 to 700,000 range. Chicago's 1.3, Philadelphia's 850 to 9, and Boston's, I think, 850. We were 600, so we were at the bottom of all those, the lowest, even below Houston.
But is the Pacific Rim is becoming so important as it is? There's becoming a huge influx of people from Asia.
Right.
Which means your numbers
are going to go up. So they're already going up. So as I said, in the last 5 years, they've doubled, 600 to 1.2. So now we actually beat the Getty last year, in case there's anybody here from the Getty, but that was just for a minute. And they're free. We're almost free. Yeah, so I'm projecting we would probably end up over 2 million eventually with these new buildings. So that's probably, and that's where we should be. Yes?
Your permanent collection,
Just a minute.
a lot of it is in storage.
A lot of our permanent collection is in storage.
So
95% to be exact.
yes, will you have a lot of additional space to show it to the public, things that haven't been out
So
for a
yeah,
long
just to be
time?
clear, the big problem with museums is a lot of work is in storage. Not all of it should be seen, by the way. I'll make that point. But yes, it's a crime to have things in dark storage. It's not acceptable to me. And in the 19th century, the great thing about those crazy 19th century galleries that I love is there was no difference between exhibition and storage. You put a lot of things, jumble them in a room, and you could see them all. So the way this museum's designed is actually to have this, wonderful jumble curated. But it looks like it curated on the whole ground floor. So the whole museum's built on open storage study centers. So you'll see lots and lots and lots of work. So 5-10 times as many work is going to be accessible. And I will say of those numbers, a lot of work's on paper and textiles that cannot be exposed to light. So yes, it will be leaps and bounds. My dream is to get rid of dark storage, get rid of not that you won't have textiles in dark spaces, but get rid of the storage you can't get to. That's part of the plan. And every museum's doing that off to the corner, but you'd have to rebuild to build from scratch, to build your museum upon that principle. And that's the principle upon which we're building the museum. That's the idea.
Quick comment about finances. Every day, rain or shine, the U.S. spends $2 billion on military. So, $2 billion. And so the museum is small potatoes, and if we could only redirect our capital towards constructive endeavors, everybody in here votes and pays taxes.
We should move money more towards art. Well, I will say this. We live in Los Angeles County, most of us. Los Angeles County pays, they don't build the buildings or buy the art, but they pay 1/3 of the operating costs of the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, and it's one of the highest numbers. So we do have an enlightened Los Angeles County, and if you get me started on spending for the arts or lack thereof, I'll be here for another hour, so I don't think I can quite address that. But we all know that there needs to be more spent for good reason.
I know you're well, can you hear me?
Yes.
You're well on in the conception's been made, and now the process apparently is underway of getting still being built. I'm interested in how the design was arrived at. Were other designs considered? Was an architect chosen before the design?
Yeah, okay. So we are not ready to get it built. We're actually getting ready to do what you'd call real schematic design. This is just a concept proposal. So in the scheme of design, concept proposal, schematic design, design development, working drawings. We're at the very beginning. I've worked with Frank Gehry, Robert Venturi, Charles Moore, Isazaki, Charlie Gwathmey, Zaha Hadid. I've worked with many of the great architects in 20 years doing this. I've worked on 12 building projects. And one of the things I realized, there are many qualified architects. The question is how you work with them. That's what creates truly great buildings, is the relationship between the client and the architect, and how much you invest the real program and spirit of the place. So I decided to reverse the process, because often museums are also built too fast. They're very complicated structures, and it's really nice to have a long time. So everybody said to me, you're out of your mind, the economy is collapsing, you're designing like $400 million buildings. I was like, it's cheap to design and think. By the time we finish, the economy will have come back. So I chose a different route, and I said I'm not choosing the architect, I'm choosing an architect to create a proposal which can be decided on by the board. And and I wanted to develop it to say that the relationship's what's key. And all these principles that you're hearing are embedded in the design. It's not what it looks like. The design may change in what it looks like, but the transparency, the horizontality, the energy efficiency, the open storage, all that will be built into the design. Peter's arguably one of the great architects. You know, you can't have an architect who's too old. You just can't, because it's a long, long process. You can't have an architect that's too young, because I work with architects too young. They make, you know, you just have to build. Architects start late because you have to build to get experience. So you need somebody in that sweet spot. They have to be great. And the reason I chose Peter Zumthor to work with, and the board will decide, is Renzo Piano was an obvious choice. He's older, but he would be an obvious choice to continue that. We discussed it among the board. He's a great architect. There are 12 museums designed by Renzo Piano. They're all good. LA should, like Disney Hall, have something a little bit unique. Another thing was to renovate the old buildings. And then there are other architects in that thing. So I made a proposal, and that's what we're pursuing on the basis that it's the philosophy and the working relationship. And I had worked with him since 2000. So people have said that, why don't you do a competition? But competitions are good in some cases, and sometimes they don't yield the best results. So this is the proposal. We put it out to the public, and everybody gets a chance to see it. Yes, I think we should probably wrap up soon here. Maybe two more?
Curious between now and say when you would be closing, I'm thinking of the recent Christopher Knight article
about box museums.
No, not about the finances, not about what you're planning for buildings, about who you're showing.
Yeah.
The skew that you.
Yes, love this topic.
There's lots of, as it's traditionally been, white male.
51% of artists are women. 5% of our American museum show are works by women on view.
Right.
It's a staggering statistic.
So that is in your curatorial control. So what can we expect in the next?
Yeah. I've been as my staff will tell you, I've been a terror on this issue, not just on women, and we've.
It's for people of color.
No, it's not just women. I'm just saying I can give you other statistics if you want them that aren't pretty. But actually, overall, the museum is very multicultural. We have the best general multicultural presentation, but it's especially in terms of contemporary art. So this whole staff has made a huge effort to diversify. Our men-women split in acquisitions probably is down to 60-40 now, and a lot of that due to historical objects where you're, And
for group exhibitions, are you tracking? Because that one gets hard.
The big issue is also more single exhibitions that are being asked for. And yes, absolutely. So we have 4 women single exhibitions coming up. I mean, Agnes Varda's coming up. I can list you, we have some surprises in store. There's a moment actually in the museum, and it's going to be only single artists, women, in a few years. So it's a big priority. It takes a lot of work by a lot of people. And let me say, it's in your control. We've just been given a grant by the Mellon Foundation in New York, because they want us to be leadership to diversify the ranks of curatorial staffs across the nation. If I were to quote you the statistics in the diversity of curatorial staffs, it would make you cry, given that art comes from all around the world. And it's a big issue, because from the curatorial staffs comes the diversity, right? It's the curators who have to make the decisions. So, and women is not, there are more women than men curators right now. So that's actually, I think that's underway, and you're seeing a lot of shifts. But the other is also important. So we've already made a lot of strides, both globally and locally quietly. We have it takes a long time to plan exhibitions. We have some big exhibitions of women artists coming up.
What would be so great, especially since you're publicly funded, each year
whether we publish them or not, people do publish them for us. So, but it's a really important issue. Yes, the question here, and I know time is up. Last question.
Other museums.
Relationship with other museums. That's a good question. I don't think it's a competition for resources at all. Not at all. In fact, I'm a big person in terms of collaboration. I think is key. And it was why I was so excited about the financial crisis, despite the fact that we had to shuffle 6 exhibitions. Everybody had to think differently about collaboration. And we need to think more about collaboration. LA is not a question of stealing resources from one museum to another. LA, the pie is going to get bigger. Most of the people we've added to the board were not on any other boards of museums. In New York, mostly you play musical chairs. The pie is going to get bigger if we do a good job. LACMA is a good training ground. Mentorships, we need more mentorships. 75% of our board had never been on a museum board. You need mentorships, you need to grow, you need more institutions, you need collaboration. We collaborated when our film program, we had to rebuild our film program, we collaborated with Film Independent. We collaborated with the Academy. We acquired a large photo collection with the Getty. And we're trying to work, and Pacific Standard Time as part of the Getty, and that conversation we've been having is all about museums working together, coordinating schedules. I'm personal friends with most of the other directors. And I think we're in a great city for that. And unlike other cities I've worked in, I actually think this is a very collaborative place, and it's exciting. So,
that you're absorbing the Architecture and Design Museum, which is across
no, I don't. No, it's a nice institution, but that's not a. Yeah. But obviously, we have a great architecture and design department. Thank you very, very much. Thank you.
Thank you. You can see now why we picked Michael, and what a great presentation. We look forward to seeing you third Thursday of every month, almost every month. Stay tuned. Come back. Thank you. Thank you.